This is James Mulvey. His title of his paper is Small Town Violence Through a Cosmopolitan Lens, Once Upon a Time in Anatolia and Conceptual Personae. James is a PhD candidate in UCC, and his research interests include film philosophy, aesthetics, contemporary cinema, and cosmopolitanism. Thank you.
Okay. I'll begin by providing a short synopsis of Once Upon a Time in Anatolia, and by briefly contextualising the cinematic work of Nuri Bilge Ceylan. I will consider why all communities resist marginalisation as a form of cultural disempowerment. This includes urban cosmopolitanism that is imposed on rural small-town communities. I'll introduce what Gilles Deleuze and Guattari referred to as the conceptual persona, the aesthetic figure to explore a becoming hybrid. I argue that this approach allows Ceylan to evaluate the violent structures that maintain small-town communities without them ever being suspected as an outsider. Ceylan literally explores small-town politics from the inside out by living in the difference and therefore providing a unique understanding of the local and the cosmopolitan. Once Upon a Time in Anatolia follows a local band of public officials in search of a body. The group includes the local police chief, 2 policemen, the prosecutor and the doctor, as they escort a murder suspect and his brother across the sparse and ancient terrain of Anatolia. The group set off into the night in pursuit of a shallow grave, and what should be a straightforward task proves to be more time-consuming and difficult than initially expected. Keenan, the accused murderer, impeded by the darkness, is not exactly sure where he buried the body. His memory of the event is addled by alcohol, and fatigue is beginning to play a part. Each time they stop to search for the body, it ends in failure, and the local police chief's anger gathers momentum, with his authority and effectiveness being undermined in front of the other public officials, his temper frays coinciding with violent and abusive outbursts as he struggles to make control over the situation. Each time they stop to look, the remaining men begin to discuss life, death, and overtime with the doctor. This film explores the darker side of the human condition through the complex flows of small-town bureaucracy, focusing on the power relations that bind these individuals. So, set over a long night and an early morning, the men act and react to each other through a hierarchy of smouldering violence and dark humour. Nuri Bilge Ceylan is a Turkish filmmaker who's made 8 features. Once Upon a Time in Anatolia is a 7th film and a Grand Prix winner at Cannes in 2011. He came to cinema late via photography, which lends a lush layer of cinematic visual brilliance. His work focuses heavily on the search for humanity, the palpable anxiety of loneliness, and the lack of the human connection that exists between people. Another reoccurring theme in his work is the relationship between people and place, and this is central to Anatolia. Okay, so this is a film about community and the preservation of the idiosyncratic behaviours that define small-town structures. The community is suspicious of outsiders, and the inhabitants attack each other about the very things they cannot change, the basis of their difference. Critically, the film probes these relations by interrogating the blurred positions that exist between the humanity of the individual and their hierarchical position in the local community. Ceylan examines his local past from the perspective of city dweller, thus exposing the violence that encompasses his small-town bureaucracy. He states, and I quote, "If you want to be realistic, you must start from specifics. Fundamentally, where we live on this planet as human beings, we're pretty much the same and share the same set of values. So, while I make movies that are very local in flavour, people all over the world seem to understand them." Ceylan's cosmopolitan perspective straddles the global-local divide. Nonetheless, it is imperative to interrogate the urban-rural forces that shape these relationships. By cosmopolitanism, I refer to Paul Rodinow's definition where he states, "That is to define cosmopolitan as an ethos of macro-interdependencies with an acute consciousness often forced upon people, of the inescapabilities and particulars of place, characters, historical trajectories and faiths." End quote. This definition seems particularly apt when one considers Anatolia. Ceylan looks across the border of the rural-urban milieu, and in this film explores the suspicions of violence that define small-town communities from both the inside and the outside. In her essay Home and Away, Nanni Moretti's The Last Customer, Laura Rasparoli interrogates the notion of community through consumerism, arguing that cultural disempowerment is a crucial factor for any community threatened by absolution. While this analysis applies to an urban community that embraces difference and fears the homogenisation of gentrification, the locals of Once Upon a Time in Anatolia fear the gaze of the cosmopolitan outsider. When the cosmopolitan lens of the city dweller shines itself on small town community, it culturally disempowers all those it interrogates, because it presupposes an attitude of knowledge, of being educated, of knowing better. In a sense, it imposes a violent process of what I term image gentrification on rural communities. The locals fear that the urbans want to recast the rural in its own image, thus the fear of the homogenisation of local attitudes. Therefore, I contend that in order to reach small local communities, a neutral image or figure is required to manoeuvre between the environs of the cosmopolitan urban and the rural local community. One that will not be suspected of being an outsider, and who possesses a lightness of touch that brings the local to the global without alienating one from the other. In chapter 3 of What is Philosophy, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari introduced the notion of conceptual persona as an idea that refutes a fixed or permanent understanding and therefore remains in a continuous state of becoming. As Deleuze and Guattari argued, no list of features of conceptual persona can be exhaustive, since they are constantly arising and vary within planes of immanence. On a given plane, different kinds of features are mixed together to make up a persona. In other words, owing to their becoming, the forces that define a conceptual persona are limitless and are contingent on their moment of conception, their reason for being, the place they occupy in history, and their function on a given plane. The conceptual persona relays the movements that define an author's plane of immanence, while simultaneously helping to create concepts. The conceptual persona inhabits the plane of immanence, acting as the internal condition for the creation of concepts, thus providing an intimate knowledge of the geography of an intellectual landscape. For Deleuze and Guattari, the conceptual persona is not the philosopher's representative, but rather the reverse. The philosopher is only the envelope of his principal conceptual persona, and of all the other persona who are intersectors to the real subject of philosophy. This is a process of becoming rather than being, where the philosopher becomes other. As the Deleuzian scholar Patricia Pisters points out, the paradox of becoming is that there are two things happening at the same time. All movements of becoming move and pull in both directions at once. Another way to think about this is that each philosopher requires the intermediary of a conceptual persona to think and speak as they lay out their plane in order to produce movement through thought. The conceptual persona appears at the appropriate moments, shifting between the pre-conceptual plane and the concept, deterritorializing from an existing plane in order to construct a new plane populated by the old concepts and figures. Deleuze and Guattari carefully distinguish between philosophy's conceptual persona and the aesthetic figure, a character more likely to be found in literature, painting, or film. While the conceptual persona creates concepts on the plane of immanence, the aesthetic figure produces effects and precepts, combining to forge sensations, taking place on the plane of composition. In cinematic terms, these are expressed in bodies and voices of actors, and through formal devices, such as framing, mise-en-scène, and editing. The eminent Deleuzian scholar Daniel Smith maintains that the writer deduces or elicits from lived experiences the differential elements that make figures function on a plane of composition. In other words, on the plane of composition, the writer or director assembles previously unrelated parts into a seamless yet disorganized whole, as Deleuze and Guattari state. The plane of composition of art and the plane of immanence of philosophy can slip into each other to the degree that parts of one may be occupied by entities of the other. A philosopher can dream up a new plane of immanence, but instead of producing concepts, they can instead populate it with figures, or as I argue, a director can transport a conceptual persona onto a plane of composition. I contend that this cross-pollination between art and philosophy gives rise to what Deleuze and Guattari call hybrid geniuses. These geniuses celebrate difference through becoming. I argue that these author-thinkers include the filmmaker Nuri Bilge Ceylan, who, in Once Upon a Time in Anatolia, renders visible the opaque inner workings of small-town bureaucracy through the character of the doctor, who, despite being an outsider, possesses an intimate yet detached knowledge of local relations and an innate understanding of the geographical and political landscape. As Ceylan says, the idea came from a real story. One of my friends who worked on the script is a doctor and lived through something like this in Turkey. Doctors are obliged to spend 2 years of their career in Anatolia, and during that time, he had to go one evening with the police in search of a body. It took until morning to find it. When asked if the doctor is closest to him in character, Ceylan replies definitely. He's rather distant from the world around him, and I'm like that. He's not as close to other people as the local townsfolk are. Ceylan blurs the line that separates the virtual from the real by permeating his narrative of his friend, the doctor, as an outsider with his own local knowledge to explore the attitudes that frame his youth. This paradoxical understanding of the world is infused in a single figure, and as Pisters points out, these two things are happening at the same time. I propose that this constitutes a becoming hybrid. Ceylan is working on the plane of composition, but requires a conceptual persona to produce movement through thought. As Deleuze and Guattari state, it is possible that the conceptual persona only rarely or elusively appears for himself. Nevertheless, he is there, and however nameless and subterranean, we must be always reconstituted by the reader. The sole purpose of the doctor is not to be a conceptual persona. He also acts as an aesthetic figure, reiterating what Deleuze and Guattari describe as the image of the two planes slipping in and out of each other, without ever fully merging, using the viewer to be constantly vigilant to the changing role of the doctor. As a conceptual persona, the doctor's moments of conception are continuously being reborn, when each character confides his fear, shame, or uncertainty in what they perceive as an outsider. They are betraying themselves with another local, who in turn is opening a window to the closed and intimate world of Anatolia. The doctor as conceptual persona is the envelope that intersects between all their personas, enabling the possibility of becoming cosmopolitan. His reason for being is that he acts as a guide for the viewer, straddling the intersection between local and outsider, and living in the difference. His place in history is defined by all the forces that surround him, including the antipathetic voices of the locals and the law. His function is to allow thought to be exercised. By filming the doctor predominantly from behind or the side, Ceylan tempers the viewer's perspective by producing sensations that alert the viewer to their tentative role as observer. When the camera is placed behind the doctor, he is literally putting his body between the spectator and the action, reminding the viewer to be respectful and alert to what they are witnessing. Ceylan creates effects and precepts that combine to produce sensation through the doctor as an aesthetic figure and cinematic device. During a conversation with Arab, a local policeman, both characters speak, but their mouths remain closed. The camera lingers behind Arab and then violently cuts to frame his aggressive face. He is confiding in the doctor his love for the territory, but warns him about its lawlessness and how you must be able to take matters into your own hands if required. Arab is literally thinking out loud and the doctor responds in kind. Referring to Ceylan's work in general, the scholar Rob White maintains that this device signifies the character's isolation, but I argue that as an aesthetic figure, it reminds the audience that they are partial to a conversation only made possible by this hybrid figure. When the camera pans to the doctor, he's standing with his back to it, and he expresses a more nihilistic attitude to life and death through quoting a poet. This is a pivotal moment, because despite both men articulating their insecurities, it is the doctor who is shown to be an outsider by sharing difference through his choice of subject matter. As Arab says, steady on, doctor, laughing at the absurdity of the doctor's statement. This is a gentle reminder to audiences that the judging attitudes of an imposed cosmopolitanism will not be tolerated by the locals, and that above all, survival trumps opinion. The doctor's voice becomes the voice of the text, mediating the audience's relationship with all the other characters. For Deleuze and Guattari, psycho-social types populate territories to provide the functions of context, placing the text in discourse and thus providing a sociological structure. Psychosocial characters provide the conditions of a given historical period through the articulation of stereotypes such as masculinity or the hardened criminal. The psychosocial characters of Once Upon a Time in Anatolia are the policeman, the police chief, the prosecutor, the local politician, and of course the suspect and his brother. They act to create a more recognisable world for the viewer, but also function in a way that allows the conceptual persona or aesthetic figure to think and create sensations, as James states. I spent my childhood in an Anatolian town. My father was a bureaucrat there, and I remember great details about small town bureaucrats. For instance, how they used to humiliate each other. There was always some sort of conflict going on, some struggle to gain authority. Ceylan relays these bureaucratic battles through the prosecutor, the chief of police, and the other policeman. The chief of police has got the prosecutor out all night on the hunt for a body and is under incredible pressure to find a solution. When his efforts are unsuccessful, he is abusive and violent to his fellow policemen. After several thwarted attempts, he assaults the accused and must be taken aside by the prosecutor, who threatens him with official sanctions for his behaviour. These men are psychosocial types, communicate only in violence, and if this violent behaviour is called into question, they blame outsiders or the European Union for not understanding their methods. In conclusion, while Ceylan's film straddles the global-local divide, his characters, or at least the psychosocial types, are culturally disempowered. As the Turkish scholar Zatem observes, the people in this film are defeated by reality. They do not have the character qualities to rule their own destiny. It is my contention that by forcing a collision between the rural and the urban, it only serves to alienate the latter by drawing borders between them, and the result is not very cosmopolitan. Adam goes on to say that films correspond to the director's effort to form an insight into the inner world of people's characters by confession. It is here that the hybrid phenomena of the conceptual persona and the aesthetic figure manoeuvre the terrains of thought, producing sensations and bringing together the rural and the urban to forge a cosmopolitan perspective. The rural and the urban share the same resistance to being homogenized, as this homogenization will not allow for a becoming. Conceptual persona lives in the difference. Aesthetic figures create the sensations required for a shared and mutual becoming cosmopolitan. Thank you very much.